And welcome everyone. I'm Raul Fernandez, a Select Board member and Chair of the Task Force to Reimagine Policing in Brookline. This is our meeting for Friday, October 9th, 2020. Thanks for being with us. This will be a relatively short meeting. We're reserving the remainder of the time this Friday morning for subcommittees that like to use that time to meet and to move our work forward. We do have just one agenda item for today, which is a continued discussion and possible vote on a potential partnership with Tufts University on their policing survey. As you may recall, about 2 weeks ago, we got a presentation and had a lengthy discussion about whether or not we should participate in this survey related to policing here in Brookline. I won't go into all the details of that presentation. If any members of the public are interested, please watch back to that meeting to watch the full presentation there. In a close vote, it was decided not to move forward. Since then, there's been sort of further conversation and further thought by members. One important thing to understand is that if once a vote has taken place, in order to reconsider that item, someone who is on the prevailing side of that vote has to actually move to reconsider that item. We will, as a task force, take a vote whether or not we want to reconsider it, not saying whether or not we'll vote yea or nay in the end, but whether or not we even want to reconsider it. And we'll open a discussion. We'll be able to hear from anybody who wants to weigh in. And then we would, at that point, take another vote on the issue itself. So I see Mike Salmon, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
I move reconsideration.
Okay, well that was quick. So Mike Salmon would like to move reconsideration on this issue. Any discussion on whether or not we should reconsider this?
Well, I can tell you why I moved reconsideration, but
please go ahead.
A very apt point. First of all, I would say that I was on the prevailing side. I voted no, and a very apt point was made, which is that if we won't get any data whatsoever from a survey if we don't avail ourselves of this. I took another careful look at the survey, although I looked at it carefully the first time as well, but I looked at it more carefully and looked at my own answers to it, which I'd had done, and I feel like it will be useful information to gather. The questions that we had about how to oversample certain populations and so forth are things that I think are appropriate to discuss here this morning, but in any case, I thought that it was sensible to take another bite at the apple.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Anyone else? And this is on the motion to reconsider. Okay, seems straightforward enough. Please go.
Me or? I think we missed some of Eitan's voice. He wasn't there for that meeting. Yeah, and so I think that's another important reason to reconsider, not necessarily. I mean, we'll vote how we vote. I think that's another important reason to reconsider.
Thanks, Malcolm. Anyone else want to weigh in? Anne, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, I haven't looked at it in the last week, but I remember that there were some language concerns about how people were being described. Was it Latinx, or there were some language concerns in the questions. Were those addressed? And I guess that's to Eitan. That we brought up in the first discussion, and you agreed that they were potentially problematic and that they would be looked at. Have those been fixed?
Well, I wasn't at the first discussion, unfortunately. That was the one meeting I missed.
Well,
Does
that's
anyone else remember this? I'm trying to look it up right now, but there were some language, the way people were being described that people felt uncomfortable with. And I'm trying to remember. It's 8 in the morning and
I
my
think,
fuzzy.
yeah.
sorry.
Oh, this is Mel. My recollection is that that was discussed and incorporated in the motion that the committee took, and that I forget the gentleman's name from Tufts agreed to accommodate those concerns.
Okay, so that has been done.
Right,
Well,
well,
it was part of the
Because
motion.
I definitely will not vote yes unless that has been done. And I'm not sure I'm going to vote yes anyway, but
No, I was, go ahead, Earl, sorry.
I'll respond. The Mel's right that was incorporated in the motion. The reason it hasn't been done is because the vote to move forward failed. So there's no reason for Brian to go forward and make those edits. If we were to vote affirmatively today to move forward, then we'll
We can
be
do
certain
that.
that he makes the edits. Yeah, but there was no reason for him to do that after our vote.
okay, because I thought
Chris-
actually it was the guy who put the survey together, and I thought he understood that those were concerns, and I would hope that he would have done that anyway, but irrelevant to this discussion. That would be part of any kind of potential yes vote on my behalf. Is that those
It
concerns
certainly would be.
are addressed?
Let's see if I can, I recall
Kristen.
discussion. I'm going to see if I can find the language.
It was my question. It was the race and ethnicity thing, and they referred to American Indians and Latino and some other race at the bottom. There were
Another point that Anne made about as well as I recall, but let's see if I can find it.
Yeah, I mean, changes at that level are straightforward to make. This already went to the field now in Medford and Somerville. I don't know whether Schaffner changed the language in light of our conversation for those surveys, but I'm sure he was just using standard survey language that we use in these kinds of surveys. But if he was receptive in that conversation to changes along these lines, I'm sure it's just a matter of changing a Microsoft Word doc.
Okay, Kristen, and a reminder, this is on the motion to reconsider. We can have a fuller conversation on the survey itself if this motion to reconsider passes. Kristen?
Yeah, thank you. Just on the motion to reconsider, I think if memory serves me correctly, without Eitan in the room, we were, because of one vote to abstain, we were one vote away from not having a clear direction. So it feels like we would then be back to what the process would be were Eitan able to attend the meeting. So it feels like it is a worthwhile process for us to be able to reconsider, given that we can then do some advocacy with a main proponent back at the table.
Thanks, Kristen. Can we move to a vote to reconsider? Anyone have anything to say before we do that? Let's go ahead and do that. The motion's on the table to reconsider for Mike Sandman. I'll move across. Good opportunity to.
Raul, you're frozen.
internet.
Mel, do we have a process
Sorry
for
about
this?
that. I'm sorry about that. I was I was dealing with some Wi-Fi stuff. Once again, the motion to reconsider is on the table. Yes, no, abstain. Kristen?
Yes.
Malcolm?
Yes.
Eitan? Yes. Alexander?
Yes.
Chi-Chi?
Yes.
Bonnie?
Yes.
Anne?
Yes.
Almas?
Yes.
Mike?
Yes.
Kimberly.
Yes.
Okay, chair votes yes. That's unanimous. All right. Let's get into discussion about this. Eitan, I'm mindful you didn't have an opportunity to speak on this the last time. Are there things you'd like to say today?
Yes, and first, let me just apologize again for missing that last meeting. I hope not to miss any meetings, and unfortunately, the one I missed is the one where we're discussing this. A few things. First of all, as I said last week, one of the reasons I really think we should do this survey is to make sure we get feedback from the widest swath of people, particularly folks who are most affected by the decisions we make, who are sometimes hard to solicit information from in a public forum like we had yesterday. But the scale of the survey, I would just reiterate, is very large. So we're going to send 25,000 solicitations, and that could be an oversample of every single resident of BHA, for example. In Medford and Somerville, the way they were doing the oversampling is by using census information by how many African-American, Latino, Asians lived in a particular census block. So we could do it that way. We could do it by the nature of housing. And we'll get, somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 responses back. I would say bare minimum. When I've done these kinds of mail solicitations in the past, I've gotten about 20% response rate. Even if we got 10% response rate, even if there's, as there often is in this situation, returned mail by people who have invalid addresses or they moved, we're going to get thousands of responses. And we can do a lot with this data. I mean, for one thing, the survey asks for people's personal stories, personal experiences with police. So forget the quantitative analysis, no graphs. We're going to get paragraph after paragraph from people who tell us about their personal experience with the police. Is it positive and negative when they've been stopped? Have they been treated unfairly? Have they been treated fairly? And we can look at that data by subpopulation. I think we all know, or we all expect that if we look at the average response in Brookline, we might see something very different than if we look at the average response by racial group. And because we're doing the oversample, we'll be able to see not just what the average response is, but what the average response looks like by different racial groups, by different people who live in different neighborhoods, different people of different ages. And I think that's going to be really core to our work. So we have some data, right? I mean, we're going to have some numbers. Here's the number of people who are happy. Here's the number of people that want to reduce the police budget. Here's the number of people that want to expand the police budget. Here's who people have average positive versus negative conversations, and we can divide that up, right? The whole goal is to get so we have enough data among different subpopulations to compare groups, and then also we'll have all of those stories. So I think that we know that when we get information from like an open forum, people say, well, I've had a good experience with the police. I've had a good experience with the police, and we don't know how universal that view is. And I think that by having a solicitation that goes out to this very, very large oversample of people who we think are most affected, who are most likely to potentially have negative interactions with the police, we'll be able to see what the diversity of views really are in Brookline, both in terms of narrative, like how would they write their experience in a story, and how would they rate the police department, how it's doing. I would also say that the survey was developed by Brian Shafter. I don't know, he's pretty humble, but he's basically one of the premier survey researchers in the country. He runs the largest study in political science. They'll have about 60,000 responses nationwide to a huge study every election year, including this year. And he's the principal investigator on that, a national study that has something like 200 participating universities. He's the number one PI for that study. So he has a national reputation. Now, any pollster, New York Times, 538, everyone knows Brian and his work. And what he did over the summer was he worked with research assistants who were all students of color at Tufts to develop this survey, to go into the field, to try to get the questions just right. And I think they produced a really good study. It's not everyone's going to think it's perfect, but it does get, I think, at the core questions we're looking for, which is, or some of the core questions we're looking for, like what are people's experience with the police? How did that vary by racial group? What do they want from the police? do they want the police interacting on these different parts of their job, for example, on mental health issues. So I think we're going to get a lot of data, and also the logistics of this are obvious. Like this is, we could make this happen in the next few weeks, or probably nothing like this we could do in the absence of this opportunity, just because of the timing and the good fortune that this was going into the field in other communities near ours. So that's my basic take. Obviously, you probably know that I also do this kind of work for my living. So I'm happy to take questions. I think if you have questions about how the data will be analyzed or what like where we'd go from here, but yeah, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to bring this up again. I think it's I think it could be a really powerful tool in our toolkit for communicating to the town about what exactly is going on in policing from the different perspectives of community members.
Thanks, Eitan. Bonnie?
I know Brian is a very respected person in his field, but he made it very clear that he left the integrity of what his students were doing intact here. He didn't put his, sorry. Whenever a critique about how it was framed was put up, he said that he tried to keep what they were doing intact without too much, or how I understood it, without too much changing of their wording. And in my opinion, it's very imperfect. If you're going to put a survey out that has anything to do with race, and you don't see that it says American Indian, and you don't see that it says Latino instead of Latinx, and then at the bottom it says some other race, it's pretty subpar. I understand the questions that it's asking, but just to be clear, it looks like a draft, and I hope that they look at it, because it has a purpose, and it was work that they are trying to do, but this is work we're trying to do. And I understand why y'all feel this needs to go out, but it's imperfect, and I'm gonna vote no still.
Yeah. So I mean, I can go back. We can go back to Brian afterwards and see like what the changes that you're looking for. I mean, obviously, like in that race question, American Indian, for example, is the way the census asks about it. So it's not like students decided that kind of thing.
It doesn't. I don't think that matters. It matters about what we're trying to do here and how we're trying to reflect ourselves. And in this context of race, that phrasing is bad. When I receive the census, there's a lot of very offensive things that happen in the census. That's a national thing. So what I'm saying is, in this context, this is not the perfect survey. And I understand nothing is perfect, but I think that's a solid critique of what's happening here.
I'm going to bring Chichi in. I'll just note one thing as a Latinx person. I use, and I hope that many more people start to use the term Latinx. However, most Latinos in the United States do not use that term or identify that way yet. I'm hoping that many more will. But you look at any data out there, and folks have not come around quite yet to using that terminology. I'll just note that. Chichi.
Yeah, I was going to note that, and also I'm not sure if there's similar issues around the term American Indian versus Native American. But my point, the thing I wanted to raise with Eitan is I raised this with Brian Schaffner, so this is just a reminder in terms of oversampling. Now, it might be a little bit of a moot point because 25,000 is almost half the population of Brookline, but the largest minority population is actually Asian, and we don't segregate by residential neighborhood starkly. So you'll have to, run it through some name programs if you want to have a representative sample or oversample of Asians.
Yeah, so I'll take the direction of this group if we wanted to move forward about what to do on that front. Yes, we could. There are, for all racial groups, we can use a statistical model to predict race. Obviously, those models with name and all those models basically use name and census block as the predictors, and they're very bad at distinguishing African Americans from whites, and so they could help with Asian Americans we have to make a decision about whether we want to do that or just focus on, say, BHA housing versus versus or just use census block. But I think that it would depend on basically what we want to oversample on with respect to race. But you're right that even if we just did a random sample of the town, we would get sufficient numbers of Asian Americans in the sample for for statistical significance. Right? We'd get hundreds of.
And I'll just say, I think that we would want to oversample folks in BHA, and there are those folks like myself, like Chair Bernard Green, who are people of color who live in Brookline, who don't live in public housing, who have lots to say about policing in Brookline as well. So both and to these things. Kristen.
Thanks. I think I have two questions, largely for Eitan. And so one of them I think is similar to the thread that Raul just introduced. My concerns were not around whether or not we should get data, whether or not it would be valuable. My questions were, why do we feel confident that the methods that we're using would encourage or help us get additional information from Black and brown people in the town, given all the other things that are going on, additional surveys, census information just having been gone through with a number of folks in the town, all the noise of election. Why do we think that this is going to be something that will be able to cut through the noise to get to Black and brown residents? It's the first question. And I think on the flip side of that is, my hypothesis going into this is that we will probably end up getting information about the perspectives of largely of white residents in the town. And I think ultimately the design of our public safety and policing reflects the general consensus in America about the design of policing and public safety. We don't do anything I detect that is fundamentally different from anywhere else. So I'm thinking about do we feel confident that we are going to get something different? And if we don't, then what? Those are the concerns that I still have at this stage.
I would just say, and I'd welcome Raul's opinion on this too. I mean, but my take is that if we present to the town meeting or to folks in the community that says, look, here are the attitudes of the white residents here, and they are very favorable to police, and that's most of the people. But we also did this oversample of non-white residents, and their views are really different. And we have very clear evidence that their views are really different. I think that goes a long way, because even if we're talking about, that's only 10% of our survey, but it's clear in that 10% that attitudes are vastly different. I think that goes a long way, because I think coming from, looking through those comments from the open session, there's a lot of people in the town whose their view is something like, our town is different, that we don't have these problems. And I think we need to show concrete evidence that they're wrong, if they are wrong. And so I think that we will get that differentiation of, we'll have the ability to differentiate people's attitudes by racial group or by neighborhood. And I think that is important. Now, how do we survey this, right? So we have, as you know, it's very hard to distinguish, say, like by name on a voter file, on a census, someone who is Black versus someone who's white. And in Brookline, it's not that easy to just say, we don't have the BHA housing is the easiest things that we can definitely send a letter to every single person on housing. What I would say is, like, when I send, we should expect it something like a 10 to 20% response rate. For folks for whom this issue is important and it's important to them, I think we'll expect higher than average turnout in the survey. That is, if policing is an important matter to them, then that's why this cuts through the noise, because it's important to them. But we have a bunch of limited ways to get information from anyone about anything, and I think that our views on this committee in the absence of something like this just doesn't go nearly as far. I don't think, I worry that town leadership, town meeting would look at what comes out of this committee in the absence of some data like that and dismiss it entirely. Because we're not representative of a town. We're a strange group of people who can commit 2 hours every Friday morning to talking about this. And I'm just deeply concerned that we have very little credibility without getting information from the community in a systematic way.
Yeah, can I ask a follow-up, Raul?
Of course.
Thank you. I definitely appreciate the answers, Eitan. And I think that two things. I don't want us to create the perception that if you didn't respond, therefore you're okay with the structures or the approaches. I don't think that the onus is on people of color in the town to respond to a survey to indicate that they may have challenges with the choices that have been made in governance. We have during the hearings with Officer Pilot and Officer Z, there was plenty of data about experiences, negative experiences with policing that were surfaced. We have lots of data. I think the other thing that I'm just wondering about is to the point that you mentioned, Eitan, about is there a way for us to do different? Does this interfere with the data collection process or the methodology that just sending a letter to residents of BHA to say this survey is coming may in and of itself not be sufficient? Is there anything that we can do with resources that we have in the town to be able to underscore that this is important to us? How can we ensure that we get your participation in this rather than just sending in the mail? Does that ruin the integrity of the survey?
Can I comment on a couple of things?
Oh, Mike, hold on for 1 second. Eitan, I think it's an interesting question. What do you think about that? Would let's say if the board of the BHA agreed to just send a note ahead of time, like, hey, you might be getting something in the mail. You will be getting something in the mail sometime soon, requesting your participation in the survey. We think it's important that you do that. Does that mess with the integrity of the process, or?
Not really. We would probably interpret it slightly differently. So we would still have, like, if we send a letter to every resident of BHA and then we do separately, like through BHA administration, say, hey, please respond to this. Essentially, then that we have with integrity a survey of BHA. And then we will have a survey of the town. That's essentially the town, not BHA, that received the survey but didn't get that extra solicitation. And so when you're analyzing those things together, you're kind of analyzing them now as two separate surveys, but you still get that. I mean, I think that would be still valuable to do. I mean, I would be on board with that. And we just say we really want to get the views of BHA as much as we could at residents, and so we did this. And then here's how that compares to a survey of the whole town. As long as we're clear and are articulating what we did, I think that has a lot of integrity to it. I think there's a good reason to do that.
Thanks, Mike.
So I have, first of all, one of the things that we discussed, and I think one of the things that sort of set people back was the fact that there's a $15,000 cost to doing this, and that absorbs 60% of the budget that's been allocated for support for the work that we're doing. And the point in thinking about, well, do I move reconsideration? One of the points that Eitan made was a very apt one when we had our subcommittee meeting, which is, think about the cost of a single complaint against a police officer by a citizen. Never mind the personal issues. Just think about the dollars and cents cost. And I have my advisory committee, my finance committee hat on here. It far exceeds $15,000. And so from an economic perspective, as it were, I would set aside, there was concern expressed about the $15,000. I want to make sure that people set that aside. The second thing is the survey asks for people to identify themselves by ethnicity. Are they African American? Are they Native American? Are they white? What are their, ethnicity is not not perhaps the best term, but I don't know what other term to use. And if you come to the majority of the population, and especially to town meeting, and say a substantial number of people of this particular ethnic group or that particular ethnic group feel like they are at a disadvantage when they are when they encounter the police, or that they're not treated fairly, I think Eitan is right that it's a powerful statistic that you can use, even if it's a very small part of the population as a whole, as opposed to anecdotes, because it's very, very easy for somebody who is in the majority, the vast majority, to say, oh, that's just a few loud voices. That's all it is. On the other hand, if you can demonstrate that there's a pattern of feeling across a particular community, you can counter that. And it's very much more difficult to say, forget about it. It's just a few cranks.
Thanks, Mike. Almas.
Yeah, in the interest of time, I just put mine on the chat because I just wanted to say that since we're talking about Brookline Housing Authority, the Reform Committee is actually doing a survey on the walk and talk. So just want to say that because that would add to what the staff survey would be doing and get into more focused details perhaps. But just want to put that out there that that is happening and that we should pay attention to, again, what the Reform Committee is also doing.
Thanks, Almas. Kimberly. Oh, Eitan, do you want to reply?
No, I don't reply. I have a question for you, Raul, but but if Kimberly had her up first.
Great, Kimberly.
Hi. So a couple of things. One, Eitan he made a comment that we aren't representatives of the town. Is that what I heard him say?
That what?
You say that, what do you mean? So you were saying that like we're not, people, we're just a group of people that the town, they don't like, we don't represent the town. Like we're not representative of the town. Is that what you said?
What I mean is that most people in our community don't have 2 hours to give to this. I mean, when we have a volunteer-led leadership, we often have boards and task force that on many dimensions are not representative of the town. So yeah, I mean, I think anyone who can spend 2 hours on a work day engaging in town volunteerism, I think is not representative of the town.
Okay. All right, I don't really know what that means, but what I wanted to say about this, so I still feel the same way I did about the survey because I don't understand. Nothing changed for me, and the survey hasn't changed. I don't see but what I just heard you guys say that you want to send it. Raul said, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm all over the place right now in my mind, so bear with me. So you want to send a survey, you want to send something to the directors at BHA, to send to residents. And so as someone who lives in BHA, right? And if maybe not me, but some people may get this survey and feel pressure to do so, feel pressure to fill out a survey. So I mean, I don't feel like that's a great idea. And if you never lived in housing and never been in a situation where you feel like you could be homeless or removed from housing if you don't do something, so sending out a letter saying fill out this survey, it's I don't know. I don't feel comfortable with that. And if you met the Kimberly that I was maybe 20 years ago, I'd be like, oh my God, I feel like I need to do that, or maybe I might get evicted. And I know that may seem extreme for you or for other people, but if you've never been homeless, you won't understand that.
Thanks, Kimberly. And I'll say we don't need to do that. I was trying to get clarification on Kristen's question about whether or not efforts to promote participation in the survey would somehow invalidate the methodology of the survey, but that's certainly not something that we need to do. So we can certainly not do that. And even in the absence of it, oh, sorry, Kimberly.
No, you go ahead. I apologize.
I say even if we don't do that, and that, I thank you for making that point. We're still going to get a lot of data. I mean, we're still going to get open-ended responses from people who want to share their personal experiences, and we'll see, I think, a much greater range of stories that people have and experiences that people want to share than we could possibly get in any other way. But we don't have to do anything that would make people feel pressure that they have to take the survey.
Can I say another thing? Raul? So I just keep thinking about this survey, and I want to believe that the survey would work, but I keep thinking, like, who's gonna sit down and fill out a survey and tell their personal story about their interaction with the police? I don't see that happening in BHA. I just don't see that. I see that happening from the people who spoke, about how great the police are, and maybe some of the young people who spoke, who they might fill it out, but again, that doesn't represent the people who are affected the most by Brookline housing. And I woke up this morning and there was 5 or 6 police cars out in BHA. I don't know what happened. I have no idea. But I just feel like this survey is not going to do what you think it's going to do. I want to believe that it will. I want to do whatever we can to make it work for this. You know what I mean? Like for what we're trying to do.
Yeah, look, that's a tough question. I mean, it's a tough perspective for me, because I do think that this is an important way for us to get people's feedback, and not everyone's going to do it. I'm going into this expecting 80 to 90% of the people who are given the survey don't do it. That's true for every survey, every poll. And some people are not going to want to fill out a paragraph. They're just going to want to say to the question, the question asks, do you have have you had negative interactions with the police? And just the click the boxes, and that's all they're going to do. And then we're going to get some people who want to share more than that. I guess, this comes down to this exact question, Kimberly, which is like, I think that this gives us helpful information in answering the questions we have, and that enough people are willing to take on a survey that will get much more information and good information than we could possibly get in the absence of this. But look, I mean, I get it. I mean, some people look at presidential polls, say, Biden's 10 points up, and they say, well, I don't believe any of that. Who knows who's answering those questions? What kind of person is responding to that? Who's not responding? Who's not at home? I can't believe any of the survey data. And so, again, there are people who are on different sides of this question of whether you can learn from, nonpartisan scholarly surveys. I'm on one side of that. I wanted to, if you don't mind, I wanted to ask Raul to weigh in, because the part of this that that I most want to learn about is something that I don't know about, which is how useful or how important is something like this when communicating the task force's recommendations to the community, to the town meeting. Like, what do our recommendations look like in the absence of this kind of data, or in the presence of the data, and how should that guide our decision making?
Yeah, for me, I mentioned this at a previous meeting, but I'm trying to imagine us producing a set of recommendations that do not include us having done some kind of systematic survey of residents in Brookline. And it's just, as speaking from my position as a select board member and someone that's here to do this work and to try to get whatever it is that we come up with to be workable and to be to pass through the select board, through town meeting, school committee, or wherever else it needs to go. This is an opportunity to get data that can help us move that forward. And I want to have every arrow in our quiver, or whatever the heck the analogy is. I want us to be able to have everything that we possibly can to make the case for what it is that we're putting together. And I certainly don't want anyone to say, we've done all this work, well, why didn't you actually do this? And including, you had an opportunity to do this and decided not to, why not? And to certainly to have to answer that question. I think there is a lot to be gained here. Are there question marks about who will complete this survey and how many folks will complete the survey? I mean, there are with any survey, frankly. I know we're going to be I will say this much too. We're not solely going to rely on this survey in producing data in our report. the subcommittee on community engagement and around envisioning is going to help us figure out how to get more data. And data doesn't just always look like check boxes on a survey. It looks like people's stories and narratives and points of view and experiences that are shared with us in many different ways. I've already got people emailing me personally stories and reaching out to me about stories that I hope to figure out how to share in a meaningful way with the group. This will all be presented in its totality, and there'll be quantitative research as well as qualitative research that I think is going to help us tell the story. And if I'm guessing, my hypothesis, there is going to be a real distinction between the perspectives of white people in this community and people of color in this community. I keep coming back to that comment that I heard that night during our hearing, which is, I think I just remember it. Oh, here it goes. Your positive experience doesn't cancel out someone else's negative experience. And I think that's something that we as a task force are going to have to figure out how to tell people over and over and over again. And I do think we need to show them. We need to hold up a mirror and to show people like, hey, this is what folks like you are saying. And here are folks that are living a very different experience in Brookline. And I think we need to do that in a number of different ways, and this surveys can help us do that.
I just add one quick thing, that because we're kind of commissioning this ourselves, we get the data. I know that if I'm analyzing the data, like I will be absolutely maximally sensitive to this question of who has taken the survey and who's not, do a lot of work to figure out whether we feel like we've gotten a representative group or not. And if for some reason this comes back and it feels like there's no way that this looks representative, even of the oversampled communities, then we won't pretend we won't pretend otherwise. We'll just, we'll be really sensitive to how the data comes back in and how representative it is. And I think that because we have kind of control of the data, anyone, and I mean, it's going to be public, but we can analyze it with great care on particularly on this front.
Thanks, Eitan. All right, we're going to move to Alexander. Before we do that, just want to be mindful of the time. It's 8:47. We have, you see in the chat, one of our task force members needs to leave at 8:55. I want to make sure that she has an opportunity to weigh in on this vote, which means I want to move us to a vote by that time. So Alexander, we haven't heard from you yet.
I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
So I want to say I agree with what Kimberly has said and what Kristen has said. I was really moved by the way Kimberly addressed this the first time we discussed this a couple of weeks ago. Similarly here, I do think that I'm not convinced that we're going to get the response that we might like to from people of color. I am also, cognizant of the fact that in terms of whether we're going to do a survey at all, this is as good as it gets and is in many ways very good because of the folks who are running it, because we're lucky enough to have Eitan who's willing to do the analysis on the data once we get it. But I'm very thoughtful about that, like how much of that problem can really be solved by oversampling, right? Of if you have like a bunch of very well-motivated white folks who feel strongly that they're being well served by police and who, often have more leisure time and they're receiving a stack of things in the mail, they've got the time to sit down, fill out this survey and turn it back in, feel really strongly about it. And maybe if you're a person of color receiving this and you have quite a long history in Brookline of good reasons to say, hey, guess what? I've brought forward my concerns before. Y'all keep asking me for my experiences and for what I've had to say. And now I've got this thing in my mailbox and I've got other stuff to do. So I'm not sure how much that can be outweighed by sampling. I'm really concerned about that. I also remain a cynic about various forms of persuasion, but I find what Raul said really persuasive because of, he has a lot of experience in town government, being part of it. And if he says that this is a really useful tool to have in the box, that's something that weighs in for me. I do want to make another push, I guess, for public outreach and organizing. I think that if we do this survey, what we should absolutely have alongside it, I think we need to get organized and getting the word out about our work. And I think we need to spend a bunch of time and effort on that. Particularly if what a lot of us are saying is that we're really concerned people are not going to respond to this. And what a bunch of us said after the public meeting, that it was fairly clear that there was some organized effort to get people to come to speak on the police's behalf. We need to be organizing to encourage people to come and speak up about their experiences. And I think we can do that about this survey as well. I don't know what it is. If it's posting flyers, if it's reaching out to community organizations to put the word out in all of their meetings, something. So this is my way of saying I'm on the fence. And these are the various things I'm talking about that are on my mind, but I'm not yet quite persuaded.
Thanks, Alexander. Let me bring Ann in, because I know Ann's one of those people saying she needs to go soon. Go ahead, Ann. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry, I am completely with Alexander. Everything Alexander just said completely exemplifies my reasons for being on the fence. If we vote yes on this, we need to do strong community outreach to folks to participate in this survey. And Alexander just said everything I would say much more articulately, because it's 8 a.m. and I'm exhausted, but he said what I feel. Thank you. I have to bring my car to a garage. I'm going to try to sign off here and then sign on by phone. I don't know if it will work or not because I'm in this remote area, but I will try to get back on, okay?
And what are the last 4 digits of your phone number so I can look for you?
I'm so tired. 2348.
Okay. I'll look for you. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
Chi-Chi.
Actually, I'm wondering if the rest of us who are our hands up would be willing to end the discussion so we could have a vote with Anne not having to dial in from her car. I was going to make a point, but I just realized it is 8:53.
Yeah. She just, well, she should be back. So she just signed off.
Oh, she did sign off.
Get her back
Okay.
in. Yeah.
And I need to leave at 9:15 for a work thing. I mean, I just wanted to say, I not only hear and understand your concerns, Alexander, I do agree with them. But I'd rather take the gamble and do this and than not, because if we don't do this, we definitely are not getting any sort of empirical, statistically valid material. We just have a lot of stories and, a lot of people testifying on one side or the other. If we are allowed to do research, outreach and organizing to say, hey, if you got this, you really need to fill it out, kind of like the census. I completely agree. We should do that. We need people to respond. But I really feel the urgency of doing this, especially after the joint public hearing, because if we just rely on public hearings and, even focus groups, I feel like, first of all, that's a lot of work. And I don't know if we're actually able to pull it off realistically, but also, that's not going to be representative either. So I'm going to vote yes. I even feel more strongly. But yeah, I mean, it could be a flop, but I'd rather take the gamble than not.
Can I just point out that we'll know more about how much of a flop it is relative to the alternative because we can see how we're sampling. So if it's true that white residents who are thrilled with the police respond at much higher rates, we'll see that and we'll be able to analyze that. If we have a 20% response rate from white residents and a 10% response rate from Black residents, we'll be able to quantify that and say, look, we can see very clearly that part of the problem here is that we have differential feedback. And we'll still have enough on the 10% to say, here are differences of opinions across groups. But I think we'll be able to say very clearly to the town, like, you look at the data and how biased it is. If you were just to be insensitive to that response rate, you would think that the town is different than it is, or that preferences are different than it is. So we really will have much more information, not just about people's views, but about how much people are willing to say, or who's willing to say things because of the quantitative instrument.
Thanks a ton. Thanks, Mike.
I want to quote to you from literature, something that in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, he writes about the class of people who can be beaten by the police. And what we need to do as a task force is to demonstrate to town meeting and to this town at large that even in Brookline, there is a class of people who feel like they can be beaten by the police. And that sounds like a curious way of putting it, but just the same, without some sort of objective data, it becomes impossible to do that. And a survey certainly makes a great deal of sense. The question that we have is this a perfect survey? And the answer is certainly not. There's no such thing as a perfect survey. But if we're going to come back with data at all to convince the middle of town meeting and the middle of the community at large that there's an issue here, and for that matter, to convince the police officers themselves that there's an issue, having this data is probably the best that we can do. And I think it was Alexander who said, this is as you use something on the order of, well, this is as good as it gets, or this is as much as we can expect. Even if it's imperfect, I've become convinced that it's an appropriate thing for us to do.
Thank you, Mike. Kristen?
Yeah, I'm just very mindful of any direction that invalidates stories, because the stories are important parts of the experience of people in the town. Walking to see a friend who lives on Clark Road, as I'm walking to their house, I see a police officer coming down the street. My heart stops because I feel like I'm in a place that I'm not expected to be, and they're here for me. And so I have to, like, that's not going to show up in a survey. And so there are lots of folks who have that experience who I don't want us to get to the point where we say that either we have data or we have stories, as if the stories aren't data. And so I'm very mindful of the fact that I can't propose an alternative for how we're to do what you described, Raul, which is to put more arrows in the quiver. I'm very conscious of that. And so I think it's going to be particularly important that when we do this, that we rely on the rigor of being able to do responsible things with this data and not let the narrative get away from us around it. And then being conscious about what this allows us to do, but also be mindful of what we cannot do with it.
The survey does give an opportunity to present stories, both good and bad, or both positive and negative. And I accept the point. I absolutely accept the point that not everybody's going to take the time to fill that out. But to the extent that that some people do, it will be I think it'll be very valuable. And I think it will be responsive, Kristen, to what you're asking.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Mike. Let's take Alexander, Kimberly, and then we do have Ann back. I'd like to move us to a vote soon while we have everyone still.
I want to say I really agree with what Kristen said. I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think you're right. And I one thing that I'm really troubled by in this conversation, and I know this is just, an expression of general frustration, and maybe it's not that helpful. I'm really frustrated by the conversation around the things you need to do in order to convince people that an obvious problem is obvious and that something that people have already told you time and time again for many years exists. Um, and I feel like there's and it gets weird, right, when we're sitting here, we're having, like, I think, thoughtful and good conversations about what can we do to persuade people, right, who haven't come around on this. And I think the more tools in the quiver, the better. um, and then I also, I also think there's people who are just, the facts are in front of you, for better or for worse. We know that this is going to happen. And you've got people coming up and telling you very vulnerable stories. And if you're not convinced by that, are you going to be convinced by numbers? And are you going to feel much more comfortable with numbers than with listening to the stories of people who you haven't wanted to listen to for years? Are you going to find it much easier to look at a number, something much more tweetable? We know, everybody who comes to town meeting, not everybody has a ton of time. And if you come into this with preconceived ideas, are you going to sit down and are you going to read all of the stories that are there? Or if you've got a couple of numbers available, are you just going to look at that and move on? So I'm troubled, and I recognize that the problem of persuading white people about racism isn't something that we can solve today, but I don't want to raise that.
No, I appreciate those comments. As someone whose job essentially right now is to try to convince people that we need to make changes and to get them to vote differently than they maybe have been in the past about this. I'm mindful of a couple things. One, stories, narratives can also be easily dismissed as, well, that's a couple people and those are their stories, but most people, including most people of color, don't experience the world that way. They can just sort of wipe away stories. They can wipe away data. Folks that want to dismiss these issues can wipe all of it away. All the work that we're doing, they can simply wipe away. And I'm also mindful that for those in positions of power with a vote, all that you need to do to maintain the status quo is just to say no. You don't have to even when faced with a compelling argument, you do not have to mount a compelling counter argument. All you have to do is say no. I'm not convinced. And you don't even have to provide a reason why. And this is why representation is so important in our community, in town meeting, on the select board and elsewhere. This is why representation is so important, because there are those people that are simply not going to want to make any changes, even when faced with mountains of evidence that change needs to be made. Those folks we're not going to be able to convince. There are some others, though. There are some others that I think, for some people, more qualitative data is going to be, going to move them either emotionally or intellectually to where many of us are. In other cases, it's going to be quantitative data that does that for them too. And so when I say the thing about the arrows in the quivers, the arrows in the quiver, I want to make sure that we have the full complement to provide the totality of evidence that is available to us when we're making our case. And so I take your points. Thank you. All right. I did not see that. Okay, so there's a question, and Kimberly, this is up to you whether or not you want to respond to it, but there's a question in the Q&A. I want to understand Kimberly's point fully because she's a task force member with experience within the BHA community. Does Kimberly feel the survey could do harm by raising anxiety or in other ways?
No, I don't think that it'll cause harm. That's not the point that when I talked about, sending it, like if BHA director sent out it in the mail saying, you expect this to come, people will feel pressured to come. And that gives anxiety. But I wasn't going to, thank you. But I want to say one other thing, Raul.
Yes.
And I think about this survey, and if you guys decide to vote yes on it, I feel in my soul an obligation as a BHA resident to go door to door and say, hey, I'm a resident and I'm a task force member, and I need you to fill out this survey because this, we need to hear your voices. I don't have the time to do that. I don't even have the time to be here, but I choose to be here because I feel so passionately about this work. And so if we're going to vote yes on this survey, can we use the other money to hire some people to knock on the doors and say, hey, we really need you to fill out the survey? But people like myself who look like me, people who had experience with the police, I don't want it needs to feel safe for people to want to do this. And people need to trust us. Brown and Black people need to trust us, because I don't trust folks in Brookline. I don't even want to be in Brookline. I choose to be in Brookline for my children. That's it. Other than that, I wouldn't be in this place because it's not for people of color. And yeah, I know we have to vote.
Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, that's certainly something we can talk about if we decide to move forward with this. Then I think the next step is to engage in deeper conversation about what it looks like to have a more organized effort. And again, I would say in BHA, but also outside of BHA, to get folks to complete this survey, especially folks from communities of color, which is the reason why we're here, which is the reason why this task force and reform committee and all of this was created, because of predominantly the experiences of people of color, especially Black people with policing. So, all right, I'd like to move us to a vote. The motion is on the floor. All voices have been heard. Let's go ahead and I'm going to move favorable action on our participation in this survey. And I'm going to make sure that we go back to the recommended edits that were recommended in our first conversation, regard to a lot of edits related to the language, related to the classification of peoples as part of that, and so forth. I'll make sure to go back to the notes and to the minutes to ensure that all of those edits are made to the survey before it goes out. So with all those edits included, moving favorable action on this, and again, going just across the screen, the first person I see is Kimberly.
No.
Okay. Eitan.
Yes.
Malcolm.
Yes.
Kristen.
Yes.
Bonnie.
No.
Alexander.
Can you come back to me?
Yes. Almas.
Yes.
Mike.
Yes.
Ann.
Yes.
Sorry, I feel like I missed Chi-Chi. There you go.
Yes.
Alexander.
I'm gonna vote yes in terms of the record, but I wanna be clear that to me, the only way I support this is if we're willing to put serious money into actual outreach across the board to folks to make sure that we get their stories, firstly in responding to the survey, and also in encouraging them to tell their stories to us. I think that's something we need to be doing anyway. And if this survey is something we're going to do, we need to get really serious about this.
I agree. Thanks, Alexander. And the chair votes yes. So that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Motion passes 9-2. Thank you all for your additional time and conversation about this. I've got lots of notes, and we're going to make sure we get the minutes out about this too. So I've got notes. This should be recorded by Big as well, and we'll get the minutes out. But thanks for taking the additional time to talk this over. We're going to reserve the rest of the time if anyone needs to meet as subcommittees. If you've already got those meetings planned and docketed, I know there's at least one group that does for that time. And otherwise, we'll be back next Friday with, I believe, a full meeting from 8 to 10. Okay? 8 time, yeah.
Sorry. So, I mean, if we want to move forward this relatively quickly, we do need to make some decisions about. I guess I need a directive whether like I should try to do the sampling issues and get it out there, or whether so the easiest thing we can do is oversample BHA. And if we oversample BHA, then we can do, I think, with integrity, if we want to, we can do additional work to try to get out the participation in BHA. In terms of oversampling by block group, other non-white residents, we can use the census data, but again, because of the nature of Brookline, it's a very blunt tool we have to do that. And I don't think we can do if we don't oversample. So if we oversample BHA, I think then we can say, okay, we're going to do additional work to try to get out this participation in BHA, and we'll know that and have a record of it. I think if we I think outside of BHA, it's a little bit trickier to think about how we get the survey right and representative if we do that. And so I think I need some direction about what to do. And I'll tell you my opinion of what to do is do a survey where we oversample BHA to the extent of basically soliciting every single person to BHA. And then separately from that, we work on, to follow up on Alexander's point, thinking about alternative mechanisms to make sure we get people's stories. And I think, but I think that for simplicity, that can be separate from the survey. I think it could be in addition to the survey in BHA, but it's very hard to think through the representativeness of the survey if we do non-BHA targeted approaches. So anyway, but I guess what I'm asking is, should I move forward, and in what way should I move forward? And does that make sense? So again, my recommendation is we come up with a sample that's oversampling BHA, and then a representative sample of the town besides that. If we want, we can oversample North Brookline, or something like that. But otherwise, then I should move forward with that now, and then by next week we can talk about other means of soliciting feedback or getting folks on board. Sorry, it's a long-winded question. I just need to know what to do next.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I know that the clock is ticking on getting this survey out. So let's go move forward. And Mel, I'm not sure if you're still with us, but I know that that there's some work that needs to be done on the town side to move this forward too.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yes, we can expedite this. There's an appropriation. It's no big deal.
Okay, great. All right. And you know what I would say is let's have further conversation about the survey itself. That can be done at the subcommittee level, on the departmental analysis subcommittee, and in terms of the organizing in the community engagement subcommittee, which I know is already working on sort of efforts related to that as well. And we can loop in efforts to promote this too. Chi-Chi, and then honestly, I've got to go. Chi-Chi.
Yeah, I've got to go too. So I wanted to put my 2 cents in terms of surveying the non-BHA part of the town. I would urge that you run it through a name program to oversample. If you want to oversample, at least for Latinx and Asians, you'll be able to have some oversampling with that. If that's not an overly burdensome thing to do, to run it through a name program.
All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate you all, and I will see you soon next time. Thanks, y'all. Have a good day.